Well, thank you, President Greenhouse, and thanks to all of you. Thanks especially to Dr. Fairman. I suddenly feel better about being 5'9". But I'd like to add my hearty congratulations to today's new members. I'll also add my hope that they take as much pleasure about being members of the American Philosophical Society as did the man I'll be talking about today. That's John James Audubon, who was elected in 1831. I have to pause now for a promotional message. I'd say that there are some Audubon documents in this glass case over here. Audubon is still very much a presence at APS. I did a good deal of research here. And one of the documents that's pulled, I think by Patrick Sparrow, was a semi-salacious letter Audubon wrote to his wife about painting a nude picture of another woman. So during the break, enjoy. But becoming a member of APS was a good experience for Audubon, although, as I'll explain in a few minutes, it was a bittersweet one, and perhaps more bitter than sweet. And yet, in 1831, Audubon found himself in very good company. The APS electees that year of 1831 consisted of 14 very distinguished men, 8 resident in the United States and 6 international. It was a very impressive collection at the time of diplomats and statesmen and gentlemen of science and one bird artist. And this is Audubon on the list at the top, but only alphabetically. You probably know a couple of these people, maybe a few. Any takers on Henry Verthaek, for instance? Professor at Princeton, later president of Dickinson College. Most people probably know Edward Everett. Here's a Lincoln connection. Everett was probably best known now for gassing on for about 2 hours at Gettysburg before Lincoln could deliver his address. That doesn't happen to all members of the society. But the point is that Audubon made his fame happen. He made himself well known. He made himself famous then, and he is certainly famous now. I think of Audubon, I call him, as I did in the title date, the first celebrity scientist in his own era, much more than Benjamin Franklin in his era, because Audubon worked at celebrity. He worked at it very aggressively, and I think very effectively. Now, celebrity. Today, we're probably comfortable with, or at least certainly accustomed to, the notion of celebrity. It's an ever-present part of our culture. And I don't mean just Kanye and the Kardashians. I can think of several celebrity scientists, Carl Sagan, Jane Goodall, Neil deGrasse Tyson, maybe even Bill Nye the Science Guy. But in Audubon's era, the idea of celebrity, the notion of being famous for being famous, was only beginning to emerge in transatlantic culture. It was spreading through and being spread by the emergence of the popular press, and these two phenomena are very much connected. And it was Audubon who very much knew how to make the most of it. Audubon's path to celebrity and to APS began really in the summer of 1826, when he sailed to Great Britain to begin producing what he always called his great work, The Birds of America. And his first stop was Liverpool, where he had the very good fortune to be invited to put some of his bird paint images, 250 of them, on display on the walls at the Liverpool Royal Institution, a learned society rather like this one. And when his show opened, Audubon felt very nervous, worried about, as he put it, what the public, the connoisseurs, and the critics might think about his work. But he soon got over that. He soon settled down. And the Royal Institution put notices of his show in the local newspapers. People came by the hundreds, and Audubon could soon crow and say, "My fame as an ornithologist and artist has flown from mouth to mouth with a rapidity that has quite astounded me." And that first taste of fame could be not just astounding to Audubon, but I think also intoxicating. And then some of the members of the Royal Institution suggested Audubon take the next step, that he charge admission to his exhibition. And that gave Audubon pause, at least a brief pause. What? Money for ornithology? Selling science and all this at a learned society? Audubon wrote to a friend, said, "My heart revolted at the thought. I could not think it consistent to become a mere showman and give up the title of J.J. Audubon Naturalist." And that was his dilemma. Showman or naturalist. The two just didn't seem to fit together, as if displaying his scientific work for a fee would somehow corrupt the purity of his scientific pursuits. That it would somehow force Audubon to surrender this title that he so much valued as a naturalist, as a man of science. He got over that. Audubon did start charging admission, and as he counted the shillings that came in, he began planning for other paying exhibitions later that year in Manchester and then in Edinburgh. And by the end of 1826, Audubon would write to his wife, Lucy, who was back in America earning money to support his art habit, that he had begun to rethink his audience. "It's not the naturalists I wish to please altogether, I assure thee," he wrote to Lucy. "It's the wealthy part of the community. Because the first can only speak well or ill of me, but the latter will fill my pockets." Now, I don't want to argue that Audubon had suddenly become a cynic or a Philistine. Not at all. I'd suggest that the experience in Liverpool, the success he had in Liverpool, had made him better able to balance these two identities as both naturalist and showman. And I think this notion of showman in Audubon had some elasticity. It's not just a question of putting on shows, putting up exhibitions of his work. Audubon always hated that, right into the end. But it did mean putting himself on display, showing himself, even showing off a bit. And he could put his work and himself on display to please a broad audience. And this painting, 1826 painting by the Scottish artist John Syme, Audubon put on the wall in the display with his birds in Edinburgh. He joined the show, as it were. His eyes, he said, looked like those of an enraged eagle. This is actually one of my favorite images of Audubon. That's the birds of America. It's Audubon. Actually, this is my favorite image of Audubon, but that's a little showman for all of us here, yes. But for all of Audubon's showmanship, he never lost sight of the members of the scientific community, and they never lost sight of him. He found that he could be a gentleman of science, which is something he liked, and he could be a celebrity as well, at least in Great Britain. And he started racking up accolades in several scientific societies, and this is very hard to see, but at the bottom of his engravings, they always included the letters FRS, Fellow of the Royal Society, and FLS, Fellow of the Linnaean Society. His art and science became merged on the page. They seem, in this sense, to validate each other. But that was in Britain. In the United States, there was one learned society that still eluded him, and that was this one. In the 1820s, Audubon desperately wanted to get into the American Philosophical Society, but a handful of detractors, and this one chief among them, George Ord of APS 1817, kept him out. Ord accused Audubon of scientific incompetence, even fraud. Or as Ord put it, Audubon was a man of presumptuous vanity, neither a scholar or a philosopher. Now, Ord didn't quite call him a showman, but he came very close in that, especially talking about Audubon's vanity. And the story of Audubon's effort to get into APS is really a long and unlovely and sometimes sordid story of petty jealousies in the scientific community at the time, such community as it was. And Audubon hated it. He said, "I can only write facts, and when I write facts, the Philadelphians call me a liar." Now, whenever Audubon used that term Philadelphian, it was almost always with a spiteful sneer. Audubon had his allies in Philadelphia. He had his allies in the American Philosophical Society, but he paid much more attention, as we all do, to his enemies. "Oh, Philadelphia, Philadelphia," Audubon moaned sarcastically in 1830. "Is it true that I am not worthy of being one of thy academicians?" But he still wanted the scientific status, the scientific validation that Philadelphia, the city of science at the time, could provide. And then On July 5th, 1831, here's another picture of Audubon, it all came together for him. While George Ord was out of the country, the American Philosophical Society elected Audubon to membership and then subscribed to buy the Birds of America. It was a great double victory for him. And Audubon writes to his engraver in London, says to Robert Havell, his engraver, says, "My enemies are all going downhill very fast, and fine reviews of my work are coming out." Then a few months later, toward the end of 1831, Audubon writes to his wife Lucy, still in Louisiana, says, "The papers have blown me up sky high." And blow him up they did. In the summer of 1831, the time that Audubon was elected to membership in this society, a London newspaper wrote about his departure from Great Britain. It says this: "The enthusiastic naturalist has gone again into the woods, and should he survive, he intends spending the rest of his days arranging his collection." Should he survive? Audubon would have loved that, because it was a note about the deadly menace of the dark forest. It was about the danger he would face as a naturalist, as a man of science. About the same time, a Philadelphia newspaper noted that Audubon, as they put it, is off for the western and northwestern forests, in whose pathless solitudes and his nature appears to revel. And then down in Washington, D.C., another paper reported about as the paper said, the tedious, difficult, and perilous journey that Audubon was going on in search of more specimens. And so it went. Numerous reports about Audubon's travels, but also about his travails, about the dangers facing him and the pathless solitudes, the perilous journeys that he would have to take. Should he survive indeed? Now, Audubon didn't have an agent or a publicist the way people do now, but the newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic told his story just the way he wanted it told. Not just about his art, not just about his birds, but about the rugged struggles to procure specimens in the wild, what I call in my book suffering for science in the American wilderness. And Audubon didn't rely on newspapers alone. He told his own story in his own writing, particularly in parts of his huge opus, Ornithological Biography, the 5-volume, 3,000-page compendium of avian information that was written to accompany the Birds of America. And in this, in addition to talking about birds, Audubon also talked about ordinary people, and he talked about one extraordinary person himself. Now, like everyone, and like every Audubon biographer, I like to focus on Audubon's remarkable avian images. I mean, they're good, quite good, and you know that, of course. But more than most people, I like to take into account and take seriously, and more seriously, I think, than some people do, Audubon's writing, which is also very good. And yeah, there's all the very detailed scientific information in Ornithological Biography. It's still very decent science. It's still very impressive ornithology. And as a birder, I sometimes look at it and really marvel at the detail that Audubon got to in that. But I also see in Ornithological Biography the autobiography of the ornithologist, and Audubon's many descriptions and depictions of himself as a man of science, a man of nature, the American woodsman, he called himself. And when I say man, I mean man, because that's what Audubon meant. He created a very masculinized image of the American naturalist, a man in the woods, a man among men. He one time wondered in his writings, he says, why is such a place as the Great Pine Forest should be so little known to Philadelphians? And there again, as that term Philadelphian used with a measure of disdain, Audubon pointed to the many young gentlemen in this town who he said are more concerned about smoothing the bows in their clothing or showing off the shape of their legs or enjoying their wines. And Audubon portrayed himself, by comparison, as somebody who would go out into the woods, outdoors with his fellow men, and do very rugged and manly things. Audubon liked to write about, for instance, facing down murderers in a frontier cabin with an Indian ally. Wrote about shooting eagles in the St. Johns River in Florida with a boatload of sailors. Shooting, or as he put it, barking squirrels in Kentucky with his fellow woodsmen, and even going hunting in the company of Daniel Boone. Now, that last bit about Daniel Boone was a complete lie. It never happened. Audubon made it up. But he never worried too much about the truth when it applied to himself, especially in writing good stories about himself, portraying himself as one of the people. And what happened was that the newspapers in America and on the other side of the Atlantic reprinted some of Audubon's stories pretty much as they were written, these stories from Ornithological Biography. And many of his exploits were indeed blown sky high in print, and people read about Audubon. They read about this naturalist in the woods. Now, there's no real way to measure this, but I would argue that in his own era, more people read Audubon's words than actually saw his birds. He didn't exhibit his work very much in public. Again, he hated that. Even when he did it for money, he didn't like to do it. But he did like to appear in print. And his own work appearing in the press got, I think, a very decent readership. And I would argue that may be the way that most Americans at the time knew John James Audubon. Now, on a larger level, there's no real way of measuring the popular appetite for science among ordinary Americans. I will say parenthetically, I have a friend, Susan Branson at Syracuse, who's working on a terrific book called Consuming Science, so stay tuned. She'll talk about the appetite for science. But as someone who started his own academic career looking at what was called history from the bottom up, that is, looking at the political perspective of ordinary people, I now think that we need to look at natural history from the bottom up, looking at the ways that ordinary people consumed science, what they experienced in popular exhibitions, what they looked at in learned societies, what they read in the press. And in the first half of the 19th century, nobody did more to provide people with science to consume, I would argue, than John James Audubon. And I think that's worthy of note, even of celebration. And I'll close with a mild confession. In my time of thinking and writing about John James Audubon, and that's been quite a bit of time, I've thought and written many things about him. And some of those things are quite critical, a few are perhaps even unkind. And showman, show-off, celebrity are really among the least insulting terms I've used for him. He's a complicated character. He's a flawed figure, let me tell you. But I'll always give Audubon one last compliment. If he could use his celebrity to help make science accessible, even exciting, to the general public, to reach beyond the learned society to society at large, then he did the sort of work that I very much admire. And I think he certainly earned his place among his fellow electees to the American Philosophical Society in 1831. And I think he should still have very good standing among those who are joining APS today. Thank you very much. I have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. And we have questions? Anybody? Jack?
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This is Jack Liu from East Lansing, Michigan, and really enjoy your talk. And could you talk a little bit about the Audubon Society and the relationship with Audubon? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Audubon would love to have a society named after himself, but he had no connection with the Audubon Society. He died in 1851. The Audubon Societies, plural actually, came into existence in the 1890s, first in Massachusetts, then Connecticut, and then the National Audubon Society in 1905. They picked Audubon's name for the identification with Audubon as a naturalist, a man of science, and of course as a birdman. But Audubon himself had no role in that.
Very good. Wait, we have one back there. Okay.
Emily Baker. I'm curious about the other side of the Atlantic, and when Audubon was elected to the Royal Society, was it before or after he was elected to APS? And in either case, I would guess that APS might have cared about the Royal Society. Whether the Royal Society cared about APS at that point would be a question. And related to that a bit, how he presented himself in England. He had the portrait done very much as the Western woodsman. Did he dress that way all the time, or did he adopt English ways when he was in London?
First, I'm not going to answer the question about which society cares more about the other. I'm sure they were enormously impressed by APS, but he did get into the Royal Society, the Linnaean Society, and a few others before he was invited to join APS. In terms of Audubon's presentation, self-presentation on the other side of the Atlantic, yes, he had the portrait by John Syme. He has the long hair, he has the fur collar, he has the gun. And Audubon always has a gun in his portraits. That's his main scientific tool. But he would write occasionally to his wife, who was back in the United States, as I said, trying to earn money to keep him in business. He wrote and said, well, I've got my hair cut. He's very proud of his hair, this long flowing hair. And then he'd let it grow out again. But I think he did like to play the American rustic or woodsman. Of course, we have the image of Franklin being in France and wearing the fur hat as well, kind of playing on his Americanness. And yet I think Audubon really began to use that as a means of self-identification, as a means of self-promotion, frankly.
Was there any reaction, any negative reaction, to the fact that virtually all of his paintings are from carcasses rather than from real life, at the same time that he was presenting himself as a naturalist? Or did people simply accept that that's the way that still lifes were?
I think at the time, people accepted that's the way science worked. That's the way you had to get specimens. You had to shoot them. They didn't fly into skyscrapers at the time because there weren't any. People didn't have mist nets. They didn't have. They could have. But they didn't have binoculars. The kind of telescopes we have. A lot of the technology that's available to ornithologists today was not available to Audubon then. And he and everybody else who was involved in the bird collection, specimen collection business, used guns. And they shot the specimen. Audubon would shoot a bird, very quickly pose it on a little frame he had, and then he would sketch it, go back and paint it, and then be done.
So he would do an intermediate sketch.
Yeah, he would sort of outline.
Sketch paint.
Yeah, and then it goes to the engravers, which is a whole other talk for another another day about how that works. No, and I think a lot of people today are disturbed by that very point, the notion that somehow Audubon was a naturalist, a friend of the bird, but he killed them. And he killed them sometimes by the dozens, indeed hundreds. He liked to shoot. He was a good shot and very proud of his ability. And yet, I think that the degree of puzzlement, even revulsion, some people might have now, was not felt at the time. Anybody who did science, anybody who did ornithology, anybody who did anything related to living animals had to kill them.
Over there.
Ronika's CSIRO Australia. Your story about the dilemma that Audubon had when about charging for an exhibition reminded me of a story from C.V. Raman, the Nobel-winning Indian physicist. Mm-hmm. And when he set up the Raman Institute in India, he was offered money by the government. He would not take it on the grounds that was compromising the purity of the science. So many of us have crossed this barrier without thinking it, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Ellen Lehman Kennel. What happened to all of the birds he killed?
They decomposed. I have to say, some of the birds Audubon and other people killed were kept as what are called skins, bird specimens. And again, you can go to the Field Museum in Chicago, any number of museums, and they'll pull out tray after tray of bird skins, and they're remarkable. The birds have been eviscerated. They have little cotton balls in their eyes, but otherwise they're as supple and as soft as you can imagine. And of course, most of us don't get a bird in the hand very much. And this is the only way you can do it. But mostly Audubon just shot, and he described one time of shooting after terns on the coast, blasting away. They're falling, just in heaps. And then he finds one that's different from the others, a sandwich tern. And he says, this is it. This is a great discovery. This is the first time this bird has been seen in America. Giving some kind of method to his, if you want to call it madness. But some of the birds he saved, most of them just were, and some he ate.
Howard Gardner, and I'm going to say I'm from Boston because I was very interested in Philadelphia as a metonym. What did it mean to readers in those days?
Well, I think that Philadelphia at the time had the reputation, as I mentioned, of being called the city of science. Boston and New York were fine, but Philadelphia was really, if you wanted scientific recognition at the time, in the early 19th century, Philadelphia was where you had to be. In a sense, you had to get your academic ticket punched at the American Philosophical Society, the Academy of Natural Sciences. And so I think that to use Philadelphia as a spiteful slur almost, because it was the people who had kept Audubon out. There's a much longer story about Audubon's inability to get an engraver in Philadelphia because people turned against him. That's why he went to England eventually.
Thank you. That's helpful.